1, 2, 3, let's go!
Hey guys, so welcome back to my podcast, Up and Adam. My name is Kennedy, and I'm so glad to be back talking with you guys. So last episode, just as an overview, it was kind of just an introduction to the podcast where I explained what I wanted to do, what I wanted my podcast to be about, how I wanted to talk about it with you guys. So it was really just kind of introducing it. But now I have some really interesting topics that I want to go over with you guys. So from the last episode to now, I've learned some really interesting concepts regarding forensic science and then just science overall. So the two main things that I want to talk about are the process of science and Locard's exchange principle. So these things might sound complicated, but it's really not at all. And I'm going to explain it in the least complicated way possible. And then once we get all of the concepts, I really want to relate Locard's exchange principle and kind of connect it to a really famous crime that I think is super interesting. And it really intertwines and relates to Locard's exchange principle. So first, I'm going to go over the process of science because it's kind of the base of all scientific research. So there's a bunch of steps to take when you're going to try and explain a scientific concept. So I'm going to do it without being too complicated. The process of science usually starts when someone makes an observation. So an observation is the first step of the scientific process. It is when someone just notices something about the world around them. Like, oh look, the apple fell from the tree. The moon looks different every night. Stuff like that. So that's the first step, is noticing the thing that confuses you. So that's observation. The next step in the scientific process is questioning. Now you're kind of going, well, why did the apple fall? Why is the moon changing shape every night? This is the step where scientists really form the question based on what they noticed. So, okay, now you have the question. Then you're going to form a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a prediction that you'll eventually test based on your question. So that's your hypothesis. It's just what you think the answer to your question is going to be. So now that you have your hypothesis, you're going to start experimenting. You're testing your hypothesis, you're collecting data, all that stuff. And then you're going to make sure that you test repeatedly, like over and over again, because you really want your answer to be 100% sure, and you don't want it to be faulty at all, because then it's not really correct. So before we get into conclusions, you're going to kind of analyze the data that you've collected from experimenting. You're going to get feedback from peers, do more research, see if anybody else has come up with an answer. And a lot of the community feedback is really important, because you kind of figure out if your whole experiment, your whole answer is really useful and not confusing, correct. You really get more information when you analyze your data before coming up with a conclusion. And then once you've done all that, then finally you'll have your conclusion, the answer to the question. So that's the process of science. It's really the main base and foundation of science in general. So I think that's really interesting and important to kind of start off with. But now we're going over Locard's exchange principle. Again, sounds complicated, Not sure if I'm saying the name right, but it's not complicated at all. It's actually really interesting. So this is a concept in the field of forensic science, and this idea is named after Dr. Edmund Locard. He developed the principle, and his kind of idea was that whenever two things come into contact with each other, there's going to be an exchange of materials between them. So these materials can be visible, non-visible. It can be fibers, fingerprints, skin cells, or it could be something visible, hair, lint, makeup, I don't know, something that rubs off when you come into contact with someone else. So these kind of materials and this theory in general is really useful when trying to solve a crime, especially murders, right? Everyone knows you need fingerprints, hair, blood, skin cells when you're trying to solve a murder because you're trying to identify who did it. So that's Locard's exchange principle. And I'm going to tell you about a crime, and I'm going to link Locard's exchange principle into it so that you kind of really get a better idea of how it's used in the field of forensic science. Now, some of the things I might talk about right now aren't very pleasing. They're a little bit violent. So if that's too much for you or it's going to freak you out, you might want to stop here. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the infamous Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. So, Richard Ramirez grew up in Juarez, Mexico, and he eventually moved with his family to El Paso, Texas, where he grew up. The family was sort of unhappy. His father had a lot of anger, was very physically abusive towards Richard's mom and his other siblings. And Richard also had a lot of head injuries while growing up. He had incidences where furniture fell on him. There was something at his school where he was concussed. So he had a lot of brain damage from a young age. And Richard also had a lot of bad influences growing up. So he had a cousin who fought in the Vietnam War, and he would always tell Richard about the awful things that he did while in Vietnam to women. He would show him pictures of the people he killed. Just really gruesome stuff that, kids shouldn't be learning about. There was also another family member, I think it was a sister-in-law that, a husband-in-law that would take Richard out to go stalk people, women in specific. So he kind of didn't know what it was like to not do that. It was the norm in his family. So that kind of is his backstory. So Richard's crime started when he had a job at a Holiday Inn hotel while he was working in high school. This was the 9th grade. So he would kind of abuse the power he had with his pass key to the hotel rooms. He would go and steal from guests, or there was a situation where a couple was staying at the hotel and he went into the room with his pass key, and the wife was alone at the time, and he attempted to sexually assault her. He was trying to steal from her. He got caught. The husband came back and started beating him up, but so he didn't really do anything there except for traumatize them. He then dropped out of high school a couple of years later, moved to San Francisco. At the time, he was staying at a hotel when the first murder he committed happened. he violently murdered a 9-year-old girl. This was the first known killing, and they wouldn't find out that he was actually the person who did this until later on when he was arrested. So after this first murder, he went to LA where he would murder, I think, about 24 other people. He was stealing, hijacking cars, breaking into houses. It was just what he did as kind of a hobby. And he went without getting caught for a really long time. Now, at one of the times he broke into a home, he ended up kicking a woman so hard in the face that he left a mark on her face of the kind of shoe he was wearing. And then when he left the house, he stepped into her garden and he ended up leaving footprints of like soil, and it kind of showed the same shoe mark that was on her face. So now they knew the shoes that he was wearing, which is kind of linked to Locard's exchange principle, right? His shoe and her face came into contact, and so there was an exchange of materials. And then when his foot and the soil came into contact, there was an exchange of materials again. So there was that. Next, he would eventually get caught. A little boy of a house he was trying to break into ended up being able to see the car that Richard was driving, and they eventually caught him in the car. And this is when they got his fingerprints, got his DNA, and they were able to start linking his fingerprints and DNA into like the other crimes that he committed, because they knew there was a serial killer, but they couldn't exactly identify who the fingerprints and blood were until they actually arrested him. So you kind of see Locard's exchange principle, because he left his fingerprints everywhere, he left blood everywhere, DNA, hair. There was, it wasn't very clean in his acts, but he didn't have a police record, so they couldn't identify him. But he did leave all of those materials behind when he came into contact with all of the things that he touched. So that's a Locard's exchange principle. I've been talking for a long time, so I think I'm going to go ahead and end the podcast here. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.